And one of the things I was taught is that the golden rule of archaeology is that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And that's something that I keep coming back to. When done well, archaeology is not just about the past, it's about the present and the future. But beyond that, we also record our rationale, why we chose to do one unit over another, how we interpreted a soil stain, what we discussed as a team before making a cut. Nothing is assumed to be obvious. I would say that even the smallest artifact, even if it's just like the chip of a bone or a piece of stone, it carries a massive story with it. Each of these objects can tell us about communal recovery, rhythms of daily life, and how it supported wellness. It was life. So the breath of the land, the blood memory, it's a relative. To be in relationship with the land is to be in relationship with everything that sustains us. The book itself was born from the land, from the voices of ancestors, and from the ongoing struggles of Indigenous peoples who were never meant to survive, but yet continue to rise.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Cree's podcast, Many Different Birds, broadcasting on CJSW Radio, where we'll be hearing authentic stories from special guests from all backgrounds and bridge the gap between non-Indigenous and Indigenous communities, with a special focus on the Canadian healthcare system. We want to open up the floor to honest discussions and get a deeper insight into how we can improve our healthcare practices and work on our own biases. You're listening to CJSW 90.9 FM, broadcasting from Calgary, Alberta, at the University of Calgary campus radio station, which sits on Treaty 7 land. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. This includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, made up of the Siksika, Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. Additionally, the University of Calgary is located near where the Bow River meets the Elbow River, a place the Blackfoot people call Mohensis, which is now known as the city of Calgary. Today's guest is a remarkable voice at the forefront of Indigenous scholarship, advocacy, and creative expression. Ben Kucher is a Métis writer, researcher, and Indigenous rights advocate, proudly descended from the Michael First Nation and a member of the Métis Nation of Alberta. He's currently completing his Master's of Arts in Anthropology at the University of Alberta, focusing on Métis material culture, trade beads, and Indigenous archaeology, reclaiming histories too often erased. Benjamin is the author of We Were Never Theirs, a powerful poetry collection that confronts colonial violence while affirming Indigenous resilience and sovereignty. He serves as the chair of the Canadian Archaeological Association's Indigenous Issues Committee, where he champions Indigenous leadership and institutional transformation. This year, Benjamin was nominated among Alberta's top 30 under 30, an achievement that brought us together and gave me the chance to meet this inspiring leader and changemaker in person. You can follow Benjamin's work on Instagram at Breaking It Down with Ben, Twitter, and Blue Sky at Truth in the Soil, and find his book, We Were Never Theirs, available now online. So welcome to the show. I'm so honored to have you here. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that introduction?
Well, thank you so much for having me. I think I'm really honored to be in this space and grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation. Honestly, I always feel a little bit strange hearing my work described in that way because while I'm the one who's speaking or writing, none of this really happens in isolation. Mm-hmm. I see it less as personal accomplishment and more as collective momentum.
Mm-hmm. That's a really, really great way to put it. So yeah, let's dive straight into our conversation. And I want to talk a little bit about archaeology because when I was younger, so I grew up in Saskatoon, and every year we would go to a children's festival, and that's, I guess, my first recollection of what archaeology meant, because we were given like these little sandboxes and then we would have to dig up tiny dinosaur fossils, and by the end of it I had this little collection of fossils piled up. And I'm starting to wonder and curious to hear, what was your intrigue with archaeology? Was it similar, and did your fascination start in a similar way? And is that what archaeologists really do? Do they take shovels and dig up sandboxes all day, but on a larger scale?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, one of the things you'll find in archaeology is that we always like to make the emphasis that it is not dinosaurs. That is paleontology. So completely different subfield and something that I know nothing about except for the fact that dinosaurs are really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
My interest in archaeology kind of stems from my interest in history. And as I was taking some history courses, I found that I needed something material, something to physically look at and go on to. So at its broadest, the Oxford Dictionary defines archaeology as the study of cultures of the past and periods of history by examining the remains of buildings and objects found in the ground. To me, that definition barely scratches the surface. Archaeology is the study of relationships, the relationships between people and our environment, and it's the link between memory and material. Archaeology is as much about presence as it is about absence. I remember a number of years ago now when I was sitting in my introduction to archaeology class, and one of the things I was taught is that the golden rule of archaeology is that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And that's something that I keep coming back to. So what archaeologists actually do is deceptively complex. We don't just excavate, we're also tasked with interpreting. We're tasked with finding ways to make artifacts, ecofacts, and features speak, and to make sure they speak accurately, ethically, and in a language that we and the communities connected to them can understand. And this is a very daunting task. It requires care, humility, and a deep sense of responsibility. Every bone, bead, soil layer, or burnt hearth tells part of a story. But those stories are incomplete without context, without community, and without a recognition of power. We work in the tension between evidence and meaning, between what survives and what was taken. For me, archaeology is about truth-telling. It's about walking into spaces where erasure has taken root and doing the slow, careful work of remembrance. When done well, archaeology is not just about the past, it's about the present and the future.
That's very, very interesting. And thanks for sharing that. So what does your day-to-day work look like? Whether that's in the field or in the lab, do you spend a lot of time doing research or do you spend a lot of time in the field?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of a mix of both. For archaeologists, we can, at least in Canada, we can only work when the ground is thawed. So that gives us a window of about May to August. So what a day-to-day looks like is the discipline to archaeology that most people don't see. Everything hinges on precision, patience, and an unrelenting commitment to documentation, not just of what we find, but how we found it, why we made the decisions we did along the way. So in the field, every action is intentional. We walk the land, we flag the smallest changes in soil texture or color, we photograph, map, take notes, and log every observation. But beyond that, we also record our rationale, why we chose to do one unit over another, how we interpreted a soil stain, what we discussed as a team before making a cut. Nothing is assumed to be obvious. And that level of transparency matters, because long after we leave our site, our field notes are what speaks for us. The lab is just as exacting. Every artifact is measured, categorized, and analyzed in painstaking detail. I've spent hours examining trade beads under magnification, noting their slight variation in glass texture, color, or wear. But again, it's not just about the data. It's about documenting how I reached that classification. What typology did I consult? What comparative sites informed my conclusions? Where did uncertainty creep in, and how did I address it? Without the full chain of reasoning, we risk misleading not just other researchers, but the communities whose histories we're trying to honor. A single misstep left unexplained can distort the record in ways that ripple outward. And in archaeology, the stakes are never neutral. Our work shapes narratives, policies, land claims, and public memory. So yes, there's a lot of technical work, and it's slow, and it requires more than a good eye. It requires a discipline in how we think, how we decide, and how we record those decisions. Because archaeology isn't just about what we find, it's about making our process transparent enough that others can follow, question, and trust what we've done.
Mm-hmm. This is all really fascinating and all very significant work, right? Like uncovering artifacts that have been buried and then trying to understand what they're actually saying and the stories that they hold. And I'm assuming you work a lot with, I guess, the Indigenous communities that occupy that land. And do they also help provide perspective on what a particular artifact means?
Yeah, I think the community aspect of doing field work is always present for me.
Mm-hmm.
Working with Indigenous communities often will have members of the community at the site who will tell us a general area that they want us to look. Or if we find something, we bring them in and get initial notes of what do you think this is? And that really informs the rest of the work that we do.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting to me that they inform where to look. And do they also inform what to look for?
In some cases, there is information about what to look for. Really, what we do when communities are telling us where we're looking is what they know from their memory and their history and oral traditions of where things might have been.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can be pointed in a general direction at a site. And then when we get to the actual area of what we're going to excavate, we base what we're looking for on the stories and oral histories that we've heard.
Mm-hmm. And is there a particular artifact or a particular object that you found that completely changed how you understood stories or storytelling or the community that was living there?
I think for me, it's not just one site or artifact. It's the cumulative experience of working across multiple contexts. These are contexts where ceremony, memory, and care are embedded into the land itself. When I originally went into the field, I went into those spaces thinking about them in archaeological terms, looking at stratigraphy, typology, and context. But what I found really challenged me to think differently, more relationally, more spiritually, and more responsively. What began to shift was my understanding was that the consistent intentional practice of care. I noticed how certain individuals, if it's a burial context, were buried with specific items, or the overall layout of a site.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. And what kind of artifacts would you find?
I think it really depends on the type of site we're excavating. In the case of maybe a burial context, we'll find remnants of medicinal plants, carved effigies. In a lot of my work, we find beads and other hunting items such as projectile points or butchered bison bones.
And what does that mean when you bury a person with a particular object? Does that signify their life or does that signify something beyond?
I think what it represents is relationships and the intentional placement of the body. It tells us something about how people understood their wellness, not just in terms of the physical health, but the spiritual readiness and the journey of the spirit afterwards. What I began to see is the landscapes themselves were a part of a healing system, and many of the sites were situated near water, along animal trails, or areas that were rich in medicine plants.
Mm-hmm. Wow. They carry a lot of knowledge that I guess isn't readily available.
I would say that even the smallest artifact, even if it's just like the chip of a bone or a piece of stone, it carries a massive story with it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I actually want to go back and talk a little bit more about trade beads because I know perhaps a lot of people don't know what that is. So from my understanding, they're beads that can be traded in for things like fur or food and other resources. And they're kind of like a monetary currency, I would say. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would say trade beads are, like you said, beads. But the ones that I'm specifically talking about in the context that I've worked, they are glass beads that have been brought over from Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And so while some of them were exchanged for food or furs or other items, really what happened for Indigenous communities is that this was an object that was introduced and then incorporated into a cultural practice.
So what do those cultural practices look like?
Yeah, so in the context of trade beads, but material culture more broadly, it's the quiet witness to how people lived. material culture becomes an important source not just of data, but of meaning. When we look at objects like medicine bundles, trade beads, ceremonial regalia, or even the spatial organization of a site, all of these hold traces in how communities practiced and lived out their lives. In many Indigenous cultures, when it comes to, let's say, health, it was never viewed purely as physical. It was relational and spiritual, and that understanding is embedded in the materials that people carried, crafted, wore, or used.
Mm-hmm. So do the trade beads represent like health in a way? Or do they represent I can see how they represent relationships. Could you expand on how they represent health and well-being?
Yeah, so talking about beads and beadwork, I'm going to draw specifically to Métis communities and how beads were not simply decorative.
Mm-hmm.
Their colors, their patterns, and their placements really held cultural significance. Analyzing those contexts helps us to understand how health and healing was enacted, not just through medicine, but through artistry, prayer, connection to land and ancestors. Each of these objects can tell us about communal recovery, rhythms of daily life, and how it supported wellness.
And do you often find these trade beads with other artifacts, or are they treated as artifacts of their own? How does that look like?
Yeah, so when it comes to trade beads, they're a very small artifact. Most of them are often under 2 millimeters in size.
Oh, wow.
So the way that we recover them from sites isn't usually by digging in the ground and immediately spotting it and being able to pull it out.
Mm-hmm.
We will take the dirt that we've excavated from a unit and it'll go through a 1/4 inch mesh screen. And as we screen out the dirt, the beads pop out.
Wow.
The beads themselves, unless they are found intact in a piece of beadwork, they all have to be treated as individual artifacts, each with their own catalog number, measurements, and descriptions.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. And each of these beads have their own, like you said, pattern or color or shape. And do each of those colors and shapes and patterns, they have a significance? Do they have like a meaning, or why that trade bead was used in particular?
Yeah, so that's something I'm actually exploring with my master's research, is to seeing what role trade beads actually played in shaping Indigenous cultural practices.
Mm-hmm.
What I can say is that the colors of the beads will often vary between Indigenous communities. Some designs may be local, some may be across the entire country.
Mm-hmm.
Really, it's just understanding how individual people and communities, maybe even families, use beadwork.
Mm-hmm. All of this is really fascinating to me, to see how archaeology can reveal stories that aren't in books, and all of these traditional medicines and systems. And it's not just about finding tools and pots, but it's also uncovering systems and systems of knowledge, and how Indigenous peoples approached working with and trading between different communities and different, I guess, settlers and Europeans that came into the land. And can you speak more about when you've come across these artifacts or evidence? Can you talk more about Indigenous healing practices? What was something that you learned that was really fascinating or new?
Yeah, so I think that speaks not just only to artifacts, but the insight that archaeology can offer in understanding of Indigenous healthcare systems or health practices. What I've come to understand through studying trade networks is that material culture itself, what was carried, exchanged, placed, and preserved, offers us a direct line into how the movement of medical or wellness knowledge happened. Trade networks weren't just economic. They were material manifestations of the intellectual, spiritual, and medical. Across what is now North America, Indigenous nations built and sustained vast trade routes that connected diverse ecological zones and cultural groups.
Mm-hmm.
Alongside fur and food moved the medicines, the roots, resins, barks, teas, and with those the knowledge of how to prepare them, when to harvest them, and what accompanied their use. I think you can track through the material record coastal plant medicines that may be found hundreds of kilometers inland, birch bark containers that are designed to hold healing salves, beads sewn into medicine bags or placed in healing lodges, These materials aren't just remnants. They're evidence of the cultural entanglement. When two or more cultures meet, there's an exchange that is rarely one-sided. It's relational, it's adaptive, and it's innovative.
I really like how you said that it's not just one-sided. And, you know, there's often when you are trading like trade beads for other resources, for instance, you're also exchanging culture and stories and different types of healing practices. Do we see a lot of, I guess, Indigenous healing practices incorporated into our Western ways that aren't so obvious?
I don't think they're explicitly incorporated in Western healthcare practices. Where I think we see some of it start to creep in is when we start to talk about mental health and emotional well-being, and acknowledging that you can heal through means that are not pharmaceutical or surgical.
And you often talk about the spiritual perspective. Would you say that's a really big part of healing and wellness?
Yeah, I think that's a really huge part of healing and wellness. And where I see that start to come in is the connection to land and landscape. For Indigenous peoples, the land was not property or backdrop to human life. It was life. So the breath of the land, the blood memory, it's a relative. To be in relationship with the land is to be in relationship with everything that sustains us. That goes from our bodies, our histories, languages, medicines, and even our futures.
That's very powerful to think of the land as our relative. And in that sense, there's no hierarchy. We're not above the land or below it. Would you say that we're almost equal or equivalent, and our responsibility is to take care of each other?
Yeah, I think this speaks to the idea that health is not an individual condition. It's not measured only in symptoms or survival, it's relational. For example, if the water is poisoned, our grief runs through it. If the animals vanish, something in us grows quiet. If the trees are clear-cut, we lose part of the breath that we didn't know we were holding. When the land is wounded, we feel it, not metaphorically, but physically and spiritually and in our bones. Well-being, then, is not just the absence of illness. It's about the presence of connection between human and other than human beings.
Wow. I almost have to sit a moment to reflect on what you're saying because it's so powerful, and I'd really encourage all of our speakers to pause and also go back and re-listen to some of this, because there's a lot of thought, there's a lot of meaning behind everything you're saying. I know you did a lot of field work recently. Is there something you do, like a ritual, or do you take time when you're out in the field to, I guess, sit in the land and kind of understand the land and the landscape? And do you take that time to sit in nature and just reflect?
Yeah, so for me personally, I think there's two kind of contexts in which this plays in. In addition to some of the excavation and fieldwork that I've done, I've also done work on ground-penetrating radar and identifying unmarked graves related to residential schools. That, of course, has its own deep spiritual significance. In the spaces that I've worked, I will bring traditional Indigenous medicines out with me. There will be daily smudging practices or something that really just grounds you in where you are and what you're doing. But speaking to the grand practice of archaeology is the landscape is everything. Before we start digging, we will spend at least a couple days walking through the landscape, seeing what we see, looking at anything that might present a challenge or something that may be an advantage to our work, and just getting to really know where we are.
Right. And then would you have to ask for permission from the communities are we allowed to enter, and are we allowed to excavate this place? How does that look like?
Yeah, I think that speaks to the heart of community-based archaeology, which is one of my areas of specialty. When we're coming in to do field work in a community-based approach, often we are not the ones showing up to a site and saying, hey, we'd like to do this. Prior to any sort of fieldwork or excavation, in my experience, at least a year and a half is taken to build a relationship with that community, to get to know who's there, what their interests are, what their values are, what their goals are, and finding a way that we as archaeologists can use the skills and knowledge that we have to advance some of those goals and explore the areas of a community's history that they want explored.
Right. I wish more researchers would take the time to do that, because a lot of the research that's done is like people are treating Indigenous communities like this almost object, like we're doing research on them rather than with them. And also research is meant to help all communities grow and also help communities understand their past, and I guess a lot of the stories that were lost, to bring them back to light.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the unique insights to archaeology and why archaeology is so important. It gives us, I guess what I can say about it is that we know far less about human history than we think we do. Most of what we call history is shaped by written records, and those records only began a few thousand years ago. And even then, they reflect the perspectives of the powerful: governments, colonizers, institutions. The vast majority of human experience, that could span hundreds and thousands of years, exists outside of written history. It's buried in the ground, it's etched into the stone, carried in the tools, and archaeology is one of the few disciplines that engages directly with those material remnants. Without archaeology, I think we lose access to the full scope of our story as human beings. We wouldn't know how early humans migrated across continents, how empires rose and fell, and how climate shifts have shaped communities, or how Indigenous peoples lived long before and long after colonial records began. And so I think every discipline, there's a call to action to develop a model of community-based research.
Right. And that goes straight into my next question, which is, why is it important for the regular person to understand archaeology, to understand the history of the land that we live on? Why is it so important that we understand those stories and we hear those stories?
Yeah, I think the importance of archaeology is that it provides a grounded reality to the truth. It gives weight to voices that may have been silenced and evidence to stories that may have been denied. I think today, where misinformation spreads fast and where history can be manipulated to serve political ends, archaeology has a role to play, because it's not just about uncovering the past, it's about confronting erasure. It's about protecting heritage that is under threat, about reshaping the narratives that define who belongs, who has rights, and whose lives matter. Archaeology makes the past visible, tangible, and a lot harder to ignore. And so in doing so, it helps us understand who we are, not just in theory, but in the traces that we've left behind.
It's very beautiful. Do you think you learned a lot about yourself through digging up artifacts and learning about other people's stories, and, like you said, the voices that were lost? Do you think you learned more about your identity and who you are?
Yeah, I think for me, doing archaeology in Métis contexts, which is my context of how I live and exist in this world, you really learn a lot about what our ancestors went through and the ways that they resisted and survived all of the impacts of colonialism. One of the things that I often think about when I'm in the field is we could be excavating in a little area, only a couple centimeters into the ground, and we're looking at something that could be anywhere from 100 to 3,000 years old. And knowing that you're sitting in the exact same place that these people who deposited this were sitting, it really makes you, or it really brings into perspective the role that archaeology has and how we exist in a very long timeline of human evolution.
That's very true. I was reading your book, and one poem particularly stuck out to me that kind of relates to this conversation we've been having about archaeology and its importance and the language of the land. And I really like how you've summarized the importance of the earth, the rivers, the mountains, and you talk about each tree, each stone, each breath of wind, and you talk about all of this evidence that's around us within the earth, the land, that can't be erased, and that yes, we may have history books, but the language lives in the land itself. I'm just quoting your book here, but yeah, that was very beautiful.
I think that really speaks to the importance of reading a book does not always give you the full picture. And a lot of the narratives, like I had mentioned earlier, are shaped by power. There's this old saying, and I don't know where it comes from, but that history is written by the victor. And so we really have to go out in the land and understand that this was the environment people lived in. What they did and what they chose to change or not change is shaped by what was around them.
Mm-hmm. And that brings us nicely into the second part of our podcast, which I'd like to discuss your book, because I can also relate to your love for writing, because ever since I was young, I used to write a lot, and probably the best thing that my parents did was give me a book and a pen, and I journal all the time about everything around me, what I did in the day, and all these mundane things. But when you look back, they're remnants of how your life used to be, and it brings you back to where you started. So I can relate to that love for writing, and I think I carried that love into adulthood as well, and I still write quite a lot. Would you say that you were quite similar in the fact that you were always an author with a talent for writing and for poetry?
I think for me, when I was growing up, I was definitely the book kid who would always be reading a book rather than watching something on TV or going to spend time outside with friends playing any sort of outdoor game. I always had this drive for knowing more, not just only about myself, but the world around me and what has unfolded. So I think my love of writing came from taking what I've learned, finding a way to approach it from a personal perspective. And one of the things that poetry gave me was a way to bring humanity back into the writing. Mm-hmm. A lot of the work I've done lives in academic spaces like journal articles, reports, presentations. And so finding a way to make room for the humanity and the emotion in writing is what brought me to poetry.
Mm-hmm. I feel like there's a lot even between the words that you haven't written about or haven't said, but it's quite loud and clear what you're trying to say. And I think that's what poetry gives, like you said, the emotion, the humanity, it brings it back to writing. And what inspired you to write this book? And why do you believe it's important for people to read it?
Yeah, so I wrote We Were Never Theirs as an act of witness. They're not just poems, they're refusals. They're the stories that insist on being seen, spoken, and remembered. The book itself was born from the land, from the voices of ancestors, and from the ongoing struggles of Indigenous peoples who were never meant to survive, but yet continue to rise. I was inspired by everything that has been silenced. The children who never came home, the ceremonies that were interrupted, the languages we've nearly lost, and the communities that were told to disappear. I've spent years as a researcher digging through records, handling objects, and walking with the land. But this book allowed me to speak plainly and unapologetically. In the foreword, I wrote that this work is part of a much larger movement, one that resists erasure, reclaims voice, and affirms that we were never theirs to take. That's still what this book is about. It's not meant to comfort, it's meant to challenge. It's meant to be remembered. And so another piece early on in the book is the dedication to Tanya. And this is to Tanya Harnett, who is Nakota from Carry the Kettle First Nation. I dedicated this book to her because she's become one of those rare people who leads with both courage and care. She holds space in an institution that often fails to understand what Indigenous presence really means. And she does so without compromising the truth. So Tanya has supported me in ways that there aren't enough words to express, and she helped make this work possible by reminding me again and again that I could speak in my own voice, on my own terms. And so this book is for those who carry that same fire, who stand their ground, and who make room for others to do the same. As to why I think people should read this book, it's because the narratives we've inherited are incomplete. Justice begins with listening, because the land remembers what so many institutions are still trying to forget. Because there are too many stories that have been buried under bureaucracy, denial, and polite silence. Because this book doesn't ask for permission to be angry or grieving or sacred. It just is. And because these words are not just mine. They belong to those who came before me, those standing beside me now, and those who will carry the fire forward long after I'm gone. This book isn't just a book of poetry. It's a call to pay attention. It's a record of survival. And it's a reminder that Indigenous people, we are still here.
I love that. And everything you said as I was reading the book, everything that you've said is something that's been constantly in my mind. I've been constantly thinking about it. I've gone back and read it. And I feel like each time I read it, there's a new meaning, a new understanding. And probably when I read it again in a week or a month or a year, I'll have new understanding. So thank you for writing the book. And I really, really hope that more people buy it and read it, because it's important for non-Indigenous people to understand what it truly means to live on this land and what has the experiences people had on this land. And it was very heartbreaking. I remember tearing up at certain parts because it was so powerful. Was there a particular section that was your favorite?
Oh, I think it's hard to choose a favorite because every section came from a different emotional space. And I think that's something you were just referencing, is you see the space in between the lines and the words that are written. And so each section kind of served a different purpose in my writing process. So instead of a favorite, I think I'll name the one that changed me the most while I was writing it. Mm-hmm. And that would be the section that I titled The Cost of Colonialism. Mm-hmm. And that's because this section isn't just about history. It's about what it feels like to live in the aftermath. It's about grief, anger, exhaustion, and the quiet violence of being told over and over again that your pain must be polite to be heard. Writing those poems meant confronting the truths that I often carry in silence. Truths about displacement, dispossession, environmental devastation, and the intergenerational impact of systems that were designed to erase us as Indigenous people. The pieces, like They Call It Progress and Apology, pushed me to say what I don't always get to say in academic spaces. Mm-hmm. That we're still being harmed, that the violence has not ended, and that no apology means anything if the extraction and erasure continue. Mm-hmm. But more than that, this section taught me that poetry can hold rage and love at the same time. That vulnerability isn't weakness, it's political. There's a line between testimony and trauma, and I tried to walk it with every line. Writing The Cost of Colonialism for me wasn't cathartic, it was uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. And it should be, because colonialism isn't something to write around. It's something to name directly and unapologetically. So while other sections feel grounding or even healing, this one was transformative. It reminded me why I started writing in the first place. Mm-hmm. Not to soothe, but to disrupt. Not to simplify, but to speak clearly about what has been done and what still needs to be undone. And if the words in that section leave people unsettled, I think they're doing exactly what they're meant to.
Mm-hmm. Apology was one of my favorite ones from that section because it was so direct. It put everything perfectly into words. And sometimes you don't need a lot of words to explain that. Sometimes apology isn't enough. It's not an action. Sometimes, from what I heard, you can say sorry. Like, from what I understood from this was that you can say sorry, but that doesn't really reflect what you're doing. And it's the actions that speak louder than that apology.
Yeah, it kind of speaks to that idea that an apology means nothing if you don't change your actions.
Mm-hmm. Well put. Exactly what I wanted to say. And Would you say that the poems came first or the idea of the book came first?
I would say that it's a mix of both. When I was writing all of these out, it was a process that came over a year and a half.
Mm-hmm.
And it was not written in a way that I expected to put this into a book. They were written as witnesses to some of the situations that I found myself in, or a response to what I've read and what I've seen. And then the idea of putting this into a book came from the idea that I think there are other people out there who may not have the words to describe what they feel, or want to find something where they can find a bit of healing, but also learn something from. And so that's when I decided to start, I saw themes in what I was writing. And so now, organizing a book, there's chapters, there's sections. Where do I put all of these in? And I think organizing the book into the sections and the way that it's written took more time than writing the poems themselves.
But the way you structured the sections makes sense. It flows. It feels like almost you're reading a novel, but it's very clearly defined. Once you read it, it makes a lot of sense why you organized it in the way you did.
Well, I'm glad it makes sense, because that was one of my biggest fears when I was putting this all together. It's like, does this make sense just in my head, or is this going to make sense to other people?
I think it makes sense, and I think it's something everyone should read. And I guess, was there a lot of did you consult other people while you were writing this, or was it purely based off of, like you said, your experiences, and when you were experiencing things or when you were reading things, that's when these poems came out?
Yeah, so explicitly in writing the book, I didn't consult anyone. This was done from personal lived experience in response to all of the situations and topics that I've explored as a person. Where I think I started to not so much consult people in the writing process, but in the idea of putting this into a published piece, was when I was talking to some of my other Indigenous friends from across the country who have done similar work. And that's when the idea of this has a meaning in it that other Indigenous youth or communities need to hear.
And oftentimes I have this own fear, so I thought I'd ask you, but oftentimes when I'm writing, sometimes I feel that I'm not the expert or the best person in the room to share particular knowledge. When did you feel that it was right, or when did you feel that you were ready to share these words, and when did you feel that you had that responsibility to share this?
Yeah, so I think I wouldn't claim to be an expert or an authority on anything that's been written, because the stories that are embedded throughout this book are not mine alone. They belong to the community of Indigenous people across this land. When it came time to this needs to be a public-facing thing, really, I was not ready for it. I simply compiled this into the idea of a book, and then my friends were like, this needs to be published, this needs to be put out. And so I think I caved a little bit to peer pressure, but I'm also glad that I did it, because part of the writing process is having your voice and your words out there in the public. It's about being vulnerable in what you're doing.
And I'm really glad you did.
I am hoping to do more of this.
I would highly encourage it. I think that you're a great author and researcher, and more people need to hear the words that you're writing.
Thank you.
And what does it mean to be an author, personally and professionally?
This is a really good question. I think for me, being an author, it's not just some label or a title. It's a commitment. It's something that I carry with me every day. in all of the spaces that I move through. I think it holds different but equally powerful meanings, both personally and professionally. So professionally, I think being an author means choosing to make your voice public in a world that doesn't always want to hear the truths that you're telling. It means turning your ideas, your lived experience, and your analysis into something that can be read, cited, shared, challenged. Mm-hmm. But it's also about precision and clarity. Because when you write as an Indigenous person, especially about colonial systems that we live under, you know that what you're putting into the world will be met with resistance. You know that it may be used, interpreted, or weaponized in ways that you can't control. So professionally, it requires discipline. It means doing the research, sitting with the discomfort, checking your own assumptions, and writing in a way that respects the people and the histories that you're accountable to. Personally, I think being an author is a little more intimate. It's the place where I put what doesn't fit anywhere else. The grief, the rage, the questions that keep me up at night. It's where I go to remember, to honor, and to survive. Because writing is not something I do lightly. It's something I do because I feel I have to. I've carried stories that felt too heavy to hold, and writing has been the one way I've learned to carry them without being crushed. There's a line that I often come back to because I've been asked countless times, how do I always know what to say, or how do I find the words? Mm-hmm. And the truth is, I don't. I fight through the silence of history, through the pressure to make my work digestible, through the fear of being too honest. And when I finally do write something, it's not just ink on paper. It's evidence that I made it through something, that I turned harm into language, made the invisible visible. So being an author to me means writing both as testimony and resistance. It means telling the stories that weren't meant to survive and making sure that they're heard.
Wow. That's very, very powerful and very deep, that you feel that sense of responsibility to tell these stories. And I like how you said that this is something you feel like you have to do, like it's almost a responsibility.
Yeah, I see it both as a responsibility and kind of as a lifeline. Mm-hmm. I carry it with the understanding that my words are not just mine. They're part of a much larger conversation and a future that I think is still being written.
Wow, that's very beautiful. I'm speechless. I don't really have much to say on that. Was there a particular story that you'd like to share, or that's really affected you and how you, I guess, do your work, or something that really influenced your writing?
Yeah, so I think one of the things I can speak to is how this book reshaped how I understand both my work and myself. Like I had mentioned earlier, a lot of my writing lived in academic spaces. It was careful, analytical, methodical. Mm-hmm. But in that process, I sometimes felt that the humanity was missing. The grief, the love, the rage, the memory. The heartbeat behind research. So this book reminded me that writing isn't just about producing knowledge. It's about building relationships with the land, community, with ancestors, and with any future readers who might need these words.
Mm-hmm. It's true. Our research process is usually quite isolated, and sometimes it makes it really, really hard to connect with the stuff that we're working with, because we're thinking about it in this process, in the system that, okay, we need an introduction, methods, background, but there's not really much space for stories and storytelling. And that's a really big part of who we are as people, and what a lot of this evidence is bringing. That's a lot of what these artifacts are what, from what I'm understanding, they're stories, and it's kind of hard to bring stories into a space where stories aren't accepted and looked at like that.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the biggest pieces of advocacy I do as a researcher, is making room for storytelling. Because prior to a written record, oral history and storytelling was how we transmitted knowledge. Mm-hmm. Let's
talk more about that. So what kind of advocacy are you currently involved in?
So I think At this point, my advocacy work continues in a lot of interconnected ways. Some of it's formal, some of it's informal. One thing that I think has become clear to me over time is that when you've been deeply involved in advocacy, you never really leave it. Even after your official role changes, people will still reach out for guidance, for feedback, or to talk through difficult situations. Right now, one of my most active and ongoing roles is with the Canadian Archaeological Association.
Mm-hmm.
Serving as the chair of the Indigenous Issues Committee is work that is national. It involves pushing for institutional accountability, ethical research practices, and concrete commitments to Indigenous representation within the discipline. It's a space where I advocate not just for policy change, but for a broader cultural shift in how archaeologists relate to Indigenous communities and shared histories. Outside of that, I'm still connected to many of the spaces that I've been a part of. Previously, I served as the Vice President Student Life of the University of Alberta's Graduate Student Association. I was the chair of the National Indigenous Advocacy Committee, and I worked closely with Indigenous student associations. So even though I no longer hold any of these positions, people continue to ask for my insight on policy drafts, advocacy strategies, or the inner workings of university governance. So in that sense, I'm still doing a little bit of everything. Sometimes I'm helping craft language that better reflects Indigenous rights. Sometimes I'm reviewing strategic plans or organizing around harm that's happened within institutional spaces. And sometimes it means just showing up as someone who has been through it before, offering the care, the clarity, or the strategy. So advocacy for me is a responsibility that I will carry beyond any formal role, because it's rooted in relationships, and it doesn't stop when the term ends or the meeting adjourns. It will continue in every email, conversation, and every act of just simply showing up.
Mm-hmm. And when did you realize that you wanted to take that role?
I don't think I've ever been ready to take on a role.
Mm-hmm.
I think what it comes from is the need for my voice, but also Indigenous voices in these spaces, because we still operate in institutions that are not meant or were not built around the idea of including Indigenous people. And so part of why I've come into some of these roles stems from my ability to write and to advocate and an understanding of what it is that we're trying to address.
Mm-hmm. It's really important to not just do research and publish papers and, create all of this, make sure that knowledge is accessible, but also to advocate for change, because at the end of the day, if we're doing research and understanding and uncovering new information and we're not putting that into action, I guess what is really the point if there's that disconnect between the two?
I think that's one of my appreciations for my background in archaeology and working in university systems is we can sit and have as many conversations as you want, but it really doesn't mean anything until change starts physically happening.
Mm-hmm. And I can imagine the amount of resistance or the challenges that have come across your path when you've been advocating for change, especially when you're trying to challenge systems that have been in place for years, and you're probably youngest in the room and you're challenging all of these people that have been working in the system for so long. I guess what are the biggest challenges or obstacles that you've encountered in your work, and how do you maintain resilience and motivation when these things get difficult?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question, and I don't know if I'm going to have a full answer for it, but I think one of the most persistent challenges is that we're advocating within systems that were never designed to include us, let alone center us. Mm-hmm. Whether it's universities, government structures, or other institutions, these systems still operate through frameworks of control, of hierarchy, and of settler authority. They'll often speak the language of reconciliation or inclusion, But when it comes to actual power sharing or accountability, there's usually a quiet refusal. You can push for months, years even, and you'll be met with smiles, delays, or silence.
Mm-hmm.
Another major challenge is the backlash. When Indigenous people speak clearly and unapologetically about harm, especially when we name it in public, we're often labeled as angry, disruptive, or unprofessional.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something I've experienced personally. Whether it's being undermined or quietly pushed out of spaces, there's a real cost to telling the truth. And it's often not the systems that change. It's those of us who are expected to absorb the harm and to carry on. And so there is an emotional toll to the work. Advocating for Indigenous rights means confronting generational grief while navigating ongoing violence. When we're talking about the expectation of Indigenous people to do both advocacy and education, we're being asked to explain the harm and propose solutions, and doing it all with composure. So we're asked to be patient in the face of resistance or diplomatic in the face of dismissal. And that expectation alone, I think, is exhausting. But at the same time, what makes it possible to keep going is the sense of responsibility, not just to the work, but to the people. And in the knowledge that I'm never doing this alone. There's a community behind me, beside me, and ahead of me. I've had mentors, peers, and other students who have reminded me that advocacy is not a solo act, it's a collective one. And so even though the work is heavy, every small shift matters. Every story that gets told, every policy that gets challenged, every space that gets reclaimed, it all adds up. So I think, yes, the challenges are real and they're constant, but so is this fire, the responsibility, and the hope that even if we don't get to see full change in our lifetime, we're building something that makes it possible for the next generation to walk with a little bit less weight.
It's a very long process to advocate for change. And I'm really glad that there's people like you that are continuing to fight for change, because it's really important to work that you're doing. And I feel like a lot of people don't choose that path because it's too hard. It's intimidating. It's also, you're challenging people, so you're going to get a lot of backlash. What advice would you give to young Indigenous advocates who want to walk multiple paths like you, like to do research, to storytell, to also advocate for communities? What advice would you give to them?
Yeah, so I think in conversations that I've had with some younger people who are the generation behind me, who are sitting here wondering if there's a place for them in these spaces, the answer bluntly is yes, there absolutely is. But it has to be a place on your own terms. So my advice would be first to start from who you are, not who an institution tells you to be, not who you've expected, not who you're expected to become, not to be seen as credible or objective. Your lived experience, your community teachings, and your family stories, they are not separate from research or advocacy. They are the research. So I don't think you need to choose between being a researcher, a storyteller, or an activist. Our ancestors have held all three of these out once, and that's part of our inheritance. Second thing that I'd like to say is don't wait for permission. Too often, institutions will reward silence and punish clarity. The world needs clarity. It needs questions. It needs fire. And so if you wait for someone to tell you that you're ready or welcome or allowed to speak, you might wait forever. Third is to find your people. You cannot carry this work alone, nor should you have to. Find the mentors who will fight for you behind closed doors. Find the community who reminds you that your value isn't in what you produce, but in how you hold yourself and others. The work is heavy, and especially when you're challenging harm. Naming truths others want to forget. You're not alone. There's a network of us out here walking beside you, even if you haven't met us yet. And so the last piece of advice that I wish someone would have told me sooner is don't get caught in the trap of perfection. There is no such thing as a perfect activist, a perfect scholar, or a perfect story. You'll make mistakes. You'll get tired. you'll feel overwhelmed. But if your work is rooted in love for your people, for the land, or for the ones who come next, then you're already doing it right. Everything I've done, whether in research, writing, governance, or advocacy, has come from that place. I've made decisions I've had to grow through. I've taken hits that I have not seen coming. But I've also found joy, purpose, and community in this work, and I would do it all over again. Because we carry more than just our own names. We carry the memories, we carry the legacy, and we carry possibility. Mm-hmm. So if you're a young Indigenous person wondering if your voice matters, it's important to know that it does. It always has. And so when you speak, when you write, when you organize, you're continuing a story that began long before us and will continue long after. So keep going, because we need these voices.
Wow, that's beautiful. And I really hope that all young Indigenous activists hear this advice, because it will really help them, especially if they're feeling alone or overwhelmed. So thank you for sharing that. And what do you think my role is? Or I'm a non-Indigenous person and there are other non-Indigenous peoples listening to this podcast. What is their role when it comes to, supporting Indigenous communities or helping tell these stories? What is our role?
Yeah, I think the piece of advice for non-Indigenous people is that there's an importance in amplifying Indigenous voices. So long, Indigenous communities have had to face with somebody who claims to speak for them when we can speak for ourselves. Mm-hmm. But another piece of it is something that you've already done by giving me the opportunity to come talk on this podcast, is giving fruits for Indigenous voices. Mm-hmm. But it's also engaging in literature like the book that I've written, where you are not just reading it for the sake of reading it. Mm-hmm. You're reading it, you're engaging with it, and you're finding your personal connection to it. And so through that, you are being an ally. You are learning the history that may be uncomfortable, but knowing where you came from helps us to get to where we need to go.
Mm-hmm. And I think you mentioned this earlier as well, that you have to play this role of educating people, but also advocating. But I guess I would also encourage people to educate themselves, to read the stories, to read the papers, the literature, listen to podcasts like these, and to really understand where everything is coming from. I think that's part of our responsibility. It's not the responsibilities of communities to tell us, to educate us. I think we have that power to educate ourselves.
Yeah, I think that sums it up very nicely, is that it is not the responsibility of Indigenous people to educate non-Indigenous people of what has happened. And it reminds me of a quote by Murray Sinclair, who was the commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And he said, reconciliation is not something Indigenous people owe to Canada. It's something Canada owes to Indigenous people. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Let's talk more about that. What is your take on reconciliation? Because I guess that's one of the buzzwords that you hear, indigenizing things, or, reconciliation, or doing land acknowledgements. What's your take on doing all of these different things that we see now?
Yeah, I think I'll start with land acknowledgements, because those are one thing that I think we see the most often in conversations about reconciliation and indigenization. It is, and it comes back to that idea of the apology. A land acknowledgement is one thing to acknowledge where you physically are, but we need to acknowledge who you are in that space, what your relationship is to the land and to the people that inhabit that place. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to more broader reconciliation, education is one thing, but we need to start taking action. Mm-hmm. There are things that need to change, and it is not only up to Indigenous communities to sit and scream until we're blue in the face for this change. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's fair. So do you think that we should continue doing land acknowledgements? Because at every meeting, at every conference, we start by doing land acknowledgements. But I don't know if now it's become like, one more thing on our checklist. How can we make these land acknowledgements more meaningful and more personal and more significant?
Yeah, so 100%, I still think they are a necessary part of this ongoing process in every meeting, every event, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
How we make them more meaningful reminds me of the teaching that I got from the late Elder Gilman Cardinal, who said that the original purpose of the land acknowledgement was not to simply just name where you are. It was to answer the 4 questions of who you are, where you come from, who your people are, and what your intention is in that space. One of the things I've been thinking about how we can make a land acknowledgement more meaningful is if Canada is not your place of birth and you've immigrated here, or English isn't your first language, think about what a land acknowledgement would look like in your mother tongue. Make it personal. Connect it to your lived experience and how you move through different spaces.
Mm-hmm. I'll definitely be reflecting on that more, and hopefully by our next podcast, we will be improving our land acknowledgement based on that.
I think you did very good with this one.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is something to think about, of the risk we run of making land acknowledgements and similar actions just like another checkbox of consultation that we've done our job.
Mm-hmm. I was at a conference, I think last year. It was on sustainable development, and the MC who was doing the land acknowledgement, she asked us to sit in a moment of silence and to really close our eyes and to think about the land, to feel the breeze. She gave us all these different sensory examples, and it was one of the most beautiful land acknowledgements that I've sat through. And I really wish that more people took the time to reflect about a land acknowledgement in that way.
That sounds very beautiful. And I think that for me, that is the core of where we're going with land acknowledgements. It's become such a repetitive, you'll see at the top of every script and every event, but what does it mean to you? Mm-hmm. And what is your relationship to everything around you?
I think that's a very good summary of this section about reconciliation and land acknowledgements. And what are you currently working on in terms of what are you advocating for, and what does that look like right now for you?
Yeah, so my current space of advocacy is really in the academic space. And what I'm currently working on is some journal articles talking about how we uphold principles of Indigenous data sovereignty and what Indigenous-centered research ethics look like. When it comes to the way in which research has become so standardized that we've created consultation policies that are a one-size-fits-all, but Indigenous communities are wide-ranging and all have their own traditions. So maybe it's time we start thinking about how we have ethical frameworks and consultation frameworks that adapt to the needs and the backgrounds of the communities you're working with, rather than the one-size-fits-all approach.
Mm-hmm. It almost sounds like each community needs to create their own framework, because, again, all Indigenous communities are not the same and do not operate the same way.
Yeah, and I think that's something Indigenous communities already have with our own sets of protocols, of ceremony, of laws. And it's the push to have non-Indigenous researchers or institutions recognize them as equal to whatever framework or agreements that they produce.
Mm-hmm. Right. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with our audience today?
I think the one thing that I would close with is that when you're engaging with Indigenous communities, with Indigenous literature, or anything related to Indigenous people of North America,
Mm-hmm.
Not everything you're going to come across is going to be comfortable.
Mm.
So the piece of advice is to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, because there are truths that are coming out that need to be faced head on and not just brushed aside.
Mm-hmm. It's a very nice summary to our conversation, and it almost feels like there's so much more that we need to dive into, but I think that almost brings us to the end of our time here. So I'll ask you one more question. So because the name of our podcast is Many Different Birds, if you were to see yourself as a bird, what kind of bird would you be and why?
Oh, this is a very hard question.
Well, I saved the hardest for the last.
You really did. I think if I was a bird, I would probably go with an eagle or a raven. Not only for their significance to Indigenous communities, but they're the most beautiful birds that I've ever seen, and they have huge wingspans and are kind of those birds that you see everywhere.
Hmm.
So they're everywhere all at once, consuming knowledge and what is going on around them.
I think that summarizes it perfectly too, because you wear so many different hats as a student, as a researcher, as an advocate, as a writer. So I'm very excited to see all the other hats that you'll be wearing in a few years.
Yeah, I think I'm interested to see what they're going to be too, and what this next chapter brings.
Mm-hmm. All good things. Thank you so much for being on our podcast today, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thanks for having me. Take care of yourself.
We want to thank CJSW, the Indigenous Global and Local Health Office, Grandmother's Lounge, and the You Create team for helping us kickstart and keep running this podcast. We couldn't have done this without your support and knowledge. And additionally, great news, we've actually created an Instagram for our podcast. So please follow us on Instagram at MDB90.9, and also keep a lookout for our LinkedIn pages and our brand new YouTube channel that's going to come out very soon.
And do let us know if you have any feedback, questions, or guests you would like to bring on this show, or if you yourself would want to be part of this show. We want to hear your voice. And lastly, thank you to everyone who tuned in. Remember to join us on CJSW, Spotify, and Apple Music for bi-weekly episodes on all topics of healthcare, with special guests and your two favorite hosts, Nidhi and Harveen.
Thank you.